The army of ghosts who built a nation remains invisible in historical memory, despite their decisive contributions to victories that determined America's survival and character. Wars are remembered through generals whose strategies shaped campaigns and presidents whose decisions guided policy, but the men who actually turned battles through courage, quick thinking, or timely action are rarely named in accounts that focus on leadership rather than on individual soldiers whose sacrifices made leaders' plans succeed or fail. The theme emerges clearly when examining 8 lives whose critical moments shaped America's fate during Civil War that tested whether nation could survive internal division. 8 critical moments occurred when individual soldiers made decisions or took actions that influenced battle outcomes in ways that cascaded into strategic consequences, affecting war's trajectory. These moments were buried with men who made them possible as official records, credited commanding officers, while omitting names of ordinary soldiers whose contributions disappeared into casualty lists and routine after-action reports. History's architecture rests on foundations built by people whose names were never recorded in monuments or textbooks that celebrate famous leaders, while ignoring anonymous soldiers who performed essential actions that victory required. The Civil War's outcome was determined partly by these forgotten men whose intelligence prevented disasters, whose courage steadied collapsing lines, whose skill solved tactical problems, and whose sacrifice bought time for reinforcements or strategic maneuvers that historians attribute to generals rather than to soldiers who executed plans under fire. These 8 soldiers represent thousands of similar cases where individual actions changed history, but where documentation failed to preserve identities of men who performed them, creating gap between what happened and what history remembers. Their stories remind us that great events result from countless small decisions made by ordinary people responding to immediate circumstances, demonstrating that history is built on invisible pillars, lives that changed world through actions that seemed routine at time, but that proved decisive when examined retrospectively by historians who rarely know names of soldiers who made difference. The farm boy who picked up spyglass was young Union cavalry scout in 1861, whose rural upbringing had taught him to observe landscape carefully and to notice details that urban soldiers missed when scanning terrain for signs of enemy movement. His assignment was routine reconnaissance near Washington during war's early months, when both sides were still organizing armies, and when capital's security depended on early warning of Confederate movements that might threaten unprepared Union forces guarding city. A young cavalry scout detects Confederate movements through combination of luck and observational skill, noticing dust clouds and distant activity that suggested large-scale troop movements rather than normal civilian traffic or small cavalry patrols. His training had emphasized distinguishing between different types of military activity, making him capable of estimating force sizes and directions from indirect evidence that less experienced observers would have dismissed as insignificant. His report seems insignificant initially because single scouts' observations could not be verified immediately, and because junior cavalry scouts were not considered reliable intelligence sources compared to information from senior officers or captured prisoners who could provide detailed accounts, until officers connect dots by correlating his report with other intelligence, suggesting Confederate forces were maneuvering for potential strike toward Washington. His observations remained one piece of unconfirmed data among hundreds of similar reports flooding headquarters daily. The farm boy's background gave him advantages that professional soldiers lacked, his familiarity with rural landscape allowing him to interpret signs that others could not read accurately. His willingness to report observations, despite uncertainty about their significance, demonstrated initiative that military hierarchy often discouraged in enlisted men, whose job was following orders rather than making judgments about strategic implications of tactical observations. The warning Lincoln never knew about prevented early Confederate strike toward capital by alerting Union commanders to movements that required repositioning forces to block potential attack routes before Confederates could exploit weaknesses in Washington's defenses. His intelligence enables defensive preparations that discouraged Confederate advance by demonstrating that element of surprise was lost and that attacking forces would face prepared opposition rather than catching defenders unprepared for. Assault on capital, whose capture would have been a devastating blow to Union morale and strategic position. Prevents Confederate strike through timely warning that allowed Union forces to strengthen positions and concentrate troops where intelligence suggested attack was most likely, making Confederate commanders reconsider whether assault had sufficient chance of success to justify risks of attacking defended capital. The deterrent effect was invisible, because attack that did not occur left no dramatic evidence of crisis averted, making Scout's contribution seem less significant than it actually was in preventing disaster that might have fundamentally altered war's trajectory. He dies weeks later in minor skirmish that was one of countless small engagements occurring constantly along lines where cavalry patrols probed enemy positions and where sudden violence erupted without warning or strategic significance. His death was routine casualty of war, where scouts faced constant danger from enemy patrols, and where life expectancy for cavalry operating near enemy lines was measured in months rather than years. His message disappears into official paperwork as routine intelligence report filed among thousands of similar documents, its significance unrecognized except by few officers who understood how scouts' timely warning had prevented potential catastrophe. Lincoln never knew that unknown farm boys' observations had contributed to Capitol's security during vulnerable period when Confederate capture of Washington might have forced Union to negotiate peace terms, recognizing Southern independence before Northern public fully committed to war effort necessary for eventual victory. The man behind Lone Cannon was artillery private at Antietam in September 1862, whose position came under intense Confederate assault after battle's opening phases had created tactical situation where gaps in Union line threatened to allow Confederate breakthrough. During chaos of battle where smoke obscured visibility and where units became disorganized through casualties and confused movements, one artillery piece remained functional after Confederate fire had killed or wounded entire crew, except this single private, who continued loading and firing despite being alone and exposed. His entire crew falls to Confederate rifle fire and artillery fragments, leaving him sole survivor of gun position that should have been abandoned according to standard military practice that recognized single artillerymen could not maintain effective fire rate against infantry assault. His stubborn stand defied tactical logic that said retreating to save himself was only sensible course when position could no longer be defended effectively by lone soldier operating weapon designed for crew of 6 to 8 men. Slows Confederate advance through sustained but slow fire that forced attacking infantry to take cover and advance cautiously rather than rushing position that appeared vulnerable, but that remained dangerous as long as cannon continued firing. For precious minutes his solitary resistance disrupted Confederate momentum at critical point in their assault, buying time that Union commanders desperately needed to organize defensive response to breakthrough, threatening entire Union position. The private's motivation was not heroism in conventional sense, but was probably combination of duty, shock, and recognition that abandoning position would mean Confederate breakthrough that might doom entire Union army. His actions were sustained for perhaps 15 or 20 minutes, that felt eternal under fire, but that represented brief moment in day-long battle, whose outcome his resistance helped determine. The minutes that saved Union line accumulated as private continued firing despite exhaustion and despite understanding that his position was untenable, once Confederates organized coordinated assault against isolated gun that could not be defended permanently by lone soldier. His actions allow reinforcements to arrive by delaying Confederate advance long enough that Union reserves could reach threatened sector and establish defensive line, preventing breakthrough that would have split Union forces and possibly won battle for Confederates. Seal critical gap in Union defenses that Confederate assault had created through overwhelming local Union positions. The reinforcements that privates' resistance allowed to arrive in time transformed tactical situation from potential disaster to stalemate, where neither side could achieve breakthrough. The gap's closure ensured that Union Army maintained cohesive defensive line rather than fragmenting into separated units that Confederates could have defeated in detail through concentration of superior force against isolated positions. He dies same day when Confederate forces finally overrun his position after reinforcements have arrived and established new defensive line, making his continued resistance unnecessary. His death was one among thousands at Antietam, bloodiest single day in American military history, where over 23,000 casualties made individual deaths indistinguishable, except to families who lost loved ones. His name, lost in casualty, list thousands long that recorded deaths without explaining circumstances or significance of individual sacrifices, reducing each soldier to entry documenting unit, rank, and cause of death without preserving details about how they died or what their deaths accomplished. The private's contribution to Union victory at Antietam was never documented in official reports that credited commanding officers with defensive success, while omitting names of soldiers whose actions had enabled commanders' plans to succeed against Confederate assault that came perilously close to achieving breakthrough that might have won battle decisively. The immigrant who had everything to prove was Irish-born infantryman in Union ranks who faced prejudice from native-born Americans who questioned immigrants' loyalty and courage, making his military service opportunity to demonstrate that Irish immigrants deserved equal status despite discrimination they faced in civilian society. He fights at Bloody Lane during Antietam's middle phase when Confederate and Union forces engaged in sustained close-range combat along Sunken Road that became killing ground, where thousands died in hours of fighting that neither side could win decisively. An Irish volunteer organizes panicked men around him when Confederate assault breaks through portion of Union line, creating moment of crisis where soldiers' natural impulse was fleeing rather than standing against attack that seemed overwhelming. Rallying collapsing line required leadership that transcended rank, his example of standing firm, encouraging others to remain when flight seemed only rational response to situation that appeared hopeless, without immediate reinforcement or tactical advantage. Panicked men respond to immigrants' steadiness because his visible courage shamed them into fighting when abandoning position would have been easier and safer choice, demonstrating that leadership emerges from action rather than from authority, and that soldiers will follow anyone who shows determination, regardless of their social background or military rank. His immigrant status actually enhanced his credibility in this moment, because his willingness to die for adopted country impressed native-born soldiers who might have questioned his motivations. Everything to prove motivated Irish volunteers' determination to stand when others fled, understanding that running would confirm prejudices about immigrants' cowardice, while fighting would demonstrate that Irish soldiers deserved respect equal to native-born Americans who claimed superior patriotism. His personal stake in battle's outcome exceeded tactical concerns about holding position, making his resistance as much about proving immigrant worth as about achieving military objectives. The turning of tide resulted from immigrants' steadying influence that helped stop Confederate breakthrough, threatening to split Union forces occupying Bloody Lane's defensive positions. His leadership prevents collapse that would have allowed Confederates to exploit gap in Union line, giving them opportunity to attack Union positions from flank or rear, where defensive preparations were inadequate to resist assault from unexpected direction. The Union Army's cohesion depended on soldiers like him, who refused to break despite tactical situations that justified retreat. Help stop breakthrough by organizing impromptu defensive line from soldiers who had been retreating individually, but who rallied around his example of determined resistance. Their collective firepower sufficient to slow Confederate advance until reinforcements could arrive and establish proper defensive positions. The minutes bought through his leadership were strategically significant despite seeming tactically insignificant, demonstrating how small-scale actions could determine battle outcomes when they occurred at critical moments, in tactical situations where momentum could shift rapidly. He falls in final charge when Confederates eventually overwhelmed position despite his efforts to hold it. His death occurring after his contribution to Union defensive success was already complete, but before anyone recognized significance of his leadership during crisis that might have ended differently without his intervention. No commendation acknowledged his role in preventing breakthrough because official reports credited commanding officers rather than enlisted men who had actually organized resistance at moment when leadership mattered most. No monument marks immigrant soldiers' grave or commemorates his sacrifice in battle that killed thousands, whose individual contributions disappeared into aggregate casualty figures rather than being recognized as specific heroic actions worthy of remembrance. His story survived only through anecdotes passed among surviving soldiers who witnessed his leadership but whose accounts were never recorded formally or incorporated into official histories that focused on generals' decisions rather than on enlisted men's courage under fire at moments when battle's outcomes hung in balance. The hidden rifleman was Confederate sharpshooter, positioned behind stone wall at Fredericksburg in December 1862, part of defensive line that enjoyed overwhelming tactical advantages over Union forces who would assault across open ground against entrenched defenders protected by natural and man-made fortifications. His position provided concealment and clear field of fire across terrain that Union troops would have to cross during assault, making him deadly threat to any officer who exposed himself while attempting to coordinate attack under fire. A Confederate marksman identifies Union officer coordinating assault through observing how troops responded to his directions and through noting his position relative to attacking formations that indicated he was commanding officer rather than ordinary soldier. The officer's role in organizing assault made him valuable target, whose elimination would disrupt Union attack coordination, making sharpshooter's decision to target him tactically significant beyond simply killing enemy soldier. Positioned behind stone wall that provided perfect defensive position, sharpshooter had time to aim carefully and compensate for distance and wind that made long-range shooting difficult even for experienced marksmen. His Confederate training emphasized marksmanship skills that regular infantry lacked, making him capable of accurate fire at ranges where ordinary soldiers' muskets were ineffective. Identifies officer through careful observation during battle's early phases, when Union forces were organizing for assault that Confederate defenders knew was coming, but whose exact timing and focus remained uncertain until Union troops began emerging from protective positions and advancing toward Confederate lines. The sharpshooter's skill and patience allowed him to select high-value targets rather than firing randomly at enemy formations, maximizing impact of his limited ammunition through selective shooting at officers whose deaths would disrupt Union tactical coordination more than killing ordinary soldiers would affect battle's outcome. The shot that changed course of battle killed Union officer who had been organizing coordinated assault that might have achieved breakthrough in Confederate defensive line if properly executed with simultaneous pressure at multiple points. His action breaks momentum of organized charge by eliminating leadership that was holding attacking formations together and directing them towards specific objectives, rather than allowing them to attack piecemeal in ways that Confederate defenders could repulse through concentrated defensive fire. Buys Confederates time by disrupting Union assault coordination at moment when sustained pressure might have overwhelmed defensive positions through weight of numbers, despite Confederate advantages in defensive positioning. The minutes gained through officers' death allowed Confederate reserves to reinforce threatened sectors and allowed artillery to adjust fire to support infantry, defending positions against Union assault that was losing coherence. Without officer who had been coordinating attack across multiple units. He dies later that afternoon from Union artillery fire that was targeting Confederate defensive positions indiscriminately, his death occurring hours after his significant contribution to Confederate defensive success, but in circumstances that made his earlier marksmanship seem routine rather than decisive. His role, overlooked by commanding officers who credited defensive success to superior Confederate positioning and to Union tactical mistakes, rather than to specific actions by individual soldiers who had disrupted Union coordination at critical moments. The sharpshooter's contribution disappeared into general narrative about Fredericksburg as Confederate defensive victory resulting from Union commanders' decision to assault entrenched positions across open ground, overshadowing specific tactical actions that had made defensive success easier by disrupting Union coordination during assault. His death in same battle that his shooting helped win meant that no one advocated for recognition of his marksmanship's impact, leaving his contribution unacknowledged in official reports that focused on strategic and tactical level rather than on individual actions that had influenced battle's flow. The man who carried colors served in 54th Massachusetts Regiment, one of first African-American units in Union Army, whose performance would influence ongoing debate about whether black soldiers should be allowed to fight rather than being relegated to labor and support roles that denied them opportunity. To demonstrate courage equal to white soldiers, a private takes regiment's flag after multiple bearers fall during assault on Fort Wagner in July 1863, recognizing that allowing colors to fall would demoralize regiment and provide enemy with symbolic victory beyond tactical significance of capturing flag itself. He advances under unimaginable pressure of Confederate defensive fire, concentrating on flag, that provided aiming point for defenders who understood that killing color bearer would demoralize attackers and might cause assault to falter if soldiers lost sight of regimental colors that guided their advance. Refusing to let flag fall required sustaining advance despite wounds and despite witnessing other color bearers dying around him, his determination to keep colors flying becoming act of defiance that inspired regiment to continue assault despite horrific casualties. Under fire that killed hundreds of 54th soldiers during assault that ultimately failed to capture fort, but that demonstrated black soldiers' courage under circumstances that would have tested any troops regardless of race. His advancement toward Confederate works while carrying colors proved that African-American soldiers possessed same courage as white soldiers, providing visible evidence that could not be denied by opponents of black military service who had claimed African Americans lacked bravery necessary for combat. Refusing to let colors fall became symbolic act whose significance transcended immediate tactical situation. His determination to advance, while carrying flag, becoming proof that abolitionists and advocates of black military service needed to counter arguments that African Americans should not be armed and allowed to fight for Union cause that included their own liberation from slavery. The symbol nation needed emerged from Private's act of carrying colors forward, despite impossible circumstances, his courage becoming evidence that abolitionists used to argue for expanding black military service beyond limited experiments in units like 54th Massachusetts. His act proves that African American soldiers deserved opportunity to fight for their freedom and for Union cause, countering racist arguments that had limited black military participation to labor and support roles, while denying them combat positions where courage could be demonstrated conclusively. Abolitionists seize on 54th's courage at Fort Wagner to demand expansion of black military recruitment, pointing to regiment's performance as proof that African Americans possessed martial qualities equal to white soldiers, and that Union was wasting potential manpower by refusing to recruit black soldiers aggressively. The political impact of Fort Wagner assault exceeded its tactical significance, influencing debates about black military service that affected Union's ability to replace casualties and maintain force levels necessary for sustaining war effort. He dies anonymous in sand after being killed during assault, his body buried in mass grave with other 54th casualties that Confederate defenders interred without marking individual graves or recording names of soldiers they had killed and buried together in effort to dishonor black soldiers by denying them individual graves that white soldiers typically received. The anonymity was deliberate insult by Confederates who refused to acknowledge black soldiers as legitimate combatants deserving military honors. Buried in mass grave without marker or record, color bearer's identity was lost, despite significance of his action during assault that changed national perception of African American soldiers' capabilities and worthiness for military service. His sacrifice contributed to expanding black recruitment that eventually brought nearly 200,000 African American soldiers into Union armies, helping to tip numerical balance decisively against Confederacy while providing freed slaves opportunity to fight for their own liberation rather than waiting passively for white soldiers to win freedom for them. The quiet genius with hammer was Union engineer at Chattanooga in autumn 1863, when Confederate siege had cut supply lines into city where Union forces were trapped and starving, facing prospect of surrender or destruction if supplies could not be restored before garrison's strength deteriorated beyond ability to resist Confederate assault. He designs makeshift bridge under fire from Confederate positions overlooking river, his engineering training allowing him to calculate load-bearing requirements and structural stability, using improvised materials that were available locally rather than waiting for proper bridging equipment that could not reach besieged city. Improvising with lumber, rope and iron salvaged from buildings and abandoned equipment, engineer created pontoon bridge that could support wagons carrying supplies while being constructed quickly enough that Confederates could not destroy it before it became operational. His overnight feat required working under artillery fire that Confederates directed at construction site, making each hour of building dangerous, as shells exploded near workers struggling to assemble bridge components in darkness that concealed their activities, but that also made construction more difficult. Under fire from Confederate artillery positions that recognized bridge's significance and attempted to destroy it before it could be completed, engineer directed construction crews while calculating structural requirements and improvising solutions to problems that proper engineering would have solved, with manufactured components unavailable in besieged city. His genius lay in recognizing what was possible with available materials, rather than insisting on proper equipment that would have taken weeks to arrive if it could reach city at all through Confederate siege lines. With hammer and engineering knowledge, quiet genius solved logistical crisis that had threatened to force Union surrender or withdrawal from Chattanooga, demonstrating that improvisation could overcome resource limitations when circumstances demanded immediate solutions to problems that conventional engineering would have required extensive time and materials to solve properly. His work enabled opening of supply line that broke Confederate siege and allowed Union forces to survive until reinforcements arrived and offensive operations could resume against Confederate positions surrounding city. The bridge that broke siege allowed General Grant to open Cracker Line that restored supplies flowing into Chattanooga, ending starvation that had threatened Union garrison's ability to continue resistance against Confederate forces besieging city. His overnight engineering feat transformed strategic situation by making Union positions sustainable rather than forcing withdrawal or surrender that would have represented devastating defeat, undoing strategic gains from previous campaigns and allowing Confederates to maintain control over Tennessee that Union forces had fought to contest throughout war's middle years. Saves thousands from starvation by restoring food supplies that garrison desperately needed after weeks of short rations had reduced soldiers to eating horses and mules to avoid complete starvation. The supply crisis had been more dangerous than Confederate military threat because starved soldiers could not fight effectively regardless of tactical positions or strategic advantages, making Engineer's Bridge as significant militarily as any battle victory in determining whether Union forces could hold Chattanooga against Confederate siege. He's killed days later in engineering accident when constructing additional fortifications around Chattanooga perimeter, his death occurring after his significant contribution to breaking siege, but before anyone recognized that his impromptu bridge had saved garrison from starvation or surrender. The accident was routine tragedy of wartime, where dangerous work killed soldiers constantly through mishaps that seemed insignificant compared to battle casualties, but that accumulated into substantial losses, reducing effective force, strength as surely as enemy action did. His brilliance forgotten because engineering achievements rarely received recognition comparable to battlefield heroics, making his contribution to Union success at Chattanooga invisible in histories that credited Grant's strategic vision rather than acknowledging that unnamed engineer's improvised bridge had enabled Grant's plans to succeed. Without bridge, Grant's strategy for breaking siege would have failed regardless of tactical skill or strategic genius, demonstrating that logistics often determined battles' outcomes more decisively than tactics or strategy, but received less historical attention than dramatic combat actions. The veteran who saw what others missed was seasoned sergeant in Union Army at Gettysburg on July 1, 1863, When Union and Confederate forces were colliding accidentally at Pennsylvania Crossroads, neither side had intended to defend or attack. He recognizes undefended ridge south of town through combination of military experience and tactical sense developed over years of campaigning that taught him to evaluate terrain's defensive value instinctively. Recognizes undefended Cemetery Hill on first day of battle when Union forces were retreating through Gettysburg after morning's fighting had gone badly. His tactical eye, seeing that ridge south of town, offered commanding position where defeated Union forces could rally and establish defensive line that would be difficult for Confederates to assault successfully. His experience made him capable of visualizing how battles would develop once forces occupied particular terrain, allowing him to anticipate that Cemetery Hill would become decisive position if Union forces seized it before Confederates recognized its significance. He urges officers to seize Ridge immediately, rather than continuing retreat beyond Gettysburg, his insistence helping to convince commanders that rallying on Cemetery Hill was better option than retreating further south, where Union forces would lose advantage of defensive terrain that could compensate for Confederate numerical superiority and tactical success during morning's engagement. Officers' willingness to listen to sergeants' tactical assessment demonstrated that experienced enlisted men's judgment was sometimes valued despite military hierarchy that typically discouraged junior ranks from offering strategic suggestions to commanding officers. Saw what others missed because his experience gave him framework for understanding terrain's significance that less experienced officers lacked despite their superior education and formal military training. The sergeant's recognition that Cemetery Hill was key to Gettysburg's defense proved correct over next 2 days, when Confederate assaults failed repeatedly to dislodge Union forces from position whose defensive advantages multiplied Union effectiveness against attackers who had to assault uphill across open ground under concentrated fire. The hill that saved Union became anchor of defensive line that Union forces maintained through 3 days of battle, its occupation on July 1st preventing Confederates from seizing commanding position that would have made Union defensive line untenable by allowing Confederate artillery to enfilade Union positions from elevated positions. His push leads to Cemetery Hill's occupation through convincing officers that immediate action was essential before Confederates recognized Ridge's significance and moved to occupy it themselves, making sergeants' tactical judgment decisive in establishing Union defensive position that would prove impossible for Confederates to break through sustained assaults on July 2nd and 3rd. Leads to occupation that established Union defensive lines anchor, making subsequent Confederate assaults extremely costly because attacking forces had to assault uphill positions that Union forces had fortified overnight after securing Cemetery Hill on battle's first evening. The defensive advantages that Hill provided were so significant that Confederates never seriously threatened to break Union center, despite repeated attempts that cost thousands of casualties without achieving breakthrough that might have won battle decisively. He dies on July 2nd during Confederate assaults on Union positions, his death occurring after his contribution to establishing Union defensive line was complete, but before anyone recognized that his tactical judgment on July 1st had been critical in determining battle's outcome. His contribution lost in chaos of 3-day battle, where thousands of individual actions combined to produce Union victory, that historians would attribute to commanding generals rather than to sergeant whose initial recognition of Cemetery Hill's significance had enabled Union defensive success. Lost in chaos that consumed over 50,000 casualties in 3 days of fighting, where individual contributions disappeared into aggregate accounts of units' actions and commanders' decisions, rather than being documented as specific heroic or tactical achievements by ordinary soldiers. The sergeant's role in establishing Union defensive position was never officially recognized, because enlisted men's tactical suggestions were not documented in ways that would have preserved their names or credited them with, influencing commanders' decisions about where to establish defensive lines that would determine battle's outcomes. The rider no one remembered was Union courier in 1864, when Sherman's armies were maneuvering through Georgia toward Atlanta, whose capture would provide Union with significant strategic and political victory before. November elections that would determine whether Lincoln could continue war effort or whether war-weary Northern voters would elect Democrats promising negotiated peace. He rides through storms that made travel dangerous and through enemy pickets that required stealth and luck to avoid capture or death. His mission to deliver intelligence about Confederate positions and movements that Sherman needed for planning operations that would isolate Atlanta from remaining Confederate supply lines. Through enemy territory controlled by Confederate cavalry patrols that would have captured or killed him if detected, Courier navigated using roads and paths he learned through questioning locals and through studying maps that were often inaccurate about terrain features that made navigation difficult even in daylight, and that became nearly impossible at night when traveling without lights to avoid detection. His journey required endurance beyond normal expectations, hours in saddle without rest, while maintaining alertness necessary for avoiding Confederate forces whose presence he detected through sounds and glimpses rather than through clear observation. To deliver intelligence to Sherman that enabled operations securing Atlanta by providing information about Confederate troop dispositions and supply routes that Sherman's staff used for planning movements that would cut Confederate supply lines into city and force evacuation or surrender. The intelligence's value exceeded tactical details it contained because timely delivery allowed Sherman to act before Confederate forces could reinforce or reposition in ways that would have complicated Union operations aimed at isolating Atlanta from remaining Confederate-held territory. No one remembered Courier after his successful delivery because Courier's roles were considered routine despite dangers they faced and despite significance of intelligence they transported, making their contributions invisible in historical accounts that focused on commanding generals who made decisions based on information that couriers had risked their lives, delivering through enemy-controlled territory, where capture meant probable execution as spy rather than treatment as prisoner of war. The message that broke Confederacy's back contained intelligence, enabling Sherman to cut off Confederate retreat path from Atlanta, forcing Confederate commander to evacuate city whose loss would be devastating, political and strategic blow to Confederate cause in months before election that would determine whether Union continued fighting or negotiated peace, recognizing Confederate independence. His delivery enables Sherman's operations that secured Atlanta in September 1864, providing Lincoln with victory that convinced Northern voters to support his re-election rather than electing Democrats whose platform promised ending war through negotiations that would have left Confederacy independent even if slavery was abolished. Secure Atlanta through operations that intelligence courier delivered, made possible by revealing Confederate weaknesses that Sherman exploited to isolate city from supply lines and reinforcements, forcing evacuation that gave Union control over critical transportation hub and manufacturing center, whose loss severely damaged Confederate war effort in Georgia and Alabama. Atlanta's capture was turning point in war's final year because it demonstrated that Union forces could achieve decisive victories and because it provided political victory that sustained Northern will to continue fighting until Confederate surrender rather than negotiating compromise peace. He never reaches next camp after delivering intelligence to Sherman, his death occurring en route between Sherman's headquarters and his next assignment, when Confederate cavalry patrol intercepted him and killed him during brief firefight that left no survivors to document encounter or preserve. Courier's identity. Killed on road, without witnesses or documentation. His service went unrecorded in official reports that documented strategic outcomes without acknowledging individual contributions that had enabled those outcomes through dangerous missions, successfully completed before final mission ended, in anonymous death. His service unrecorded because courier missions were considered routine and because successful deliveries received less attention than missions that failed through courier's capture or death before reaching destination, creating documentation bias, where failures were investigated, while successes were simply expected as normal performance of duties that required no special recognition, despite extraordinary courage and skill that dangerous missions demanded. From men who accepted assignments knowing that failure would probably mean death in enemy territory far from support or rescue. The forgotten hands that steered history belonged to soldiers whose names never survived on paper despite their decisive contributions to battles and campaigns that determined Civil War's outcome and America's future. The truth emerges when examining how wars actually unfold through countless individual decisions and actions, rather than through commanding generals' plans that depend on ordinary soldiers executing orders competently and sometimes heroically under circumstances that demand more than routine performance of assigned duties. The Civil War was shaped not only by giants like Lincoln, whose political leadership sustained Northern will to fight, Grant, whose strategic vision coordinated Union military operations, and Lee, whose tactical brilliance prolonged Confederate resistance, but equally by men whose names never survived in historical records that focused on famous leaders while omitting ordinary soldiers who performed essential actions. These 8 soldiers were representative of thousands whose contributions disappeared into casualty lists and routine reports that documented outcomes without preserving identities of individuals who had made those outcomes possible, through intelligence, courage, leadership, or sacrifice. They remind us that history is built on invisible pillars, supporting visible structures that receive all attention and recognition, while foundations remain unexamined and unacknowledged by historians who focus on famous people and dramatic events, rather than on ordinary people whose small actions accumulated into large consequences. Lives that changed world through decisions made in moments of crisis or through sustained performance of dangerous duties deserve remembrance equal to famous leaders who received credit for victories that unnamed soldiers actually achieved, through their blood and courage, then vanished into mass graves and casualty lists that reduced them to numbers, documenting war's human cost, without preserving their stories or acknowledging their specific contributions to outcomes that historians attribute to generals and politicians. The 8 soldiers whose stories this account preserves represent all forgotten soldiers whose actions shaped history, but whose names and deeds disappeared because documentation systems recorded outcomes and casualties while omitting details about individual performances that determined whether missions succeeded or failed, whether positions held or collapsed, whether intelligence reached commanders or died with couriers ambushed on dark roads far from anyone who would remember them. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a positive comment below. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming.